Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this rule. And for the benefit of my colleagues, I want to be very clear about one of the implications of the language in this rule that is before us. A vote for this rule is a vote to shut off the mechanisms of the War Powers Resolution for the next 2 months. If any member of this House has any concerns about the ongoing military operations in Iraq, the potential of U.S. military airstrikes in Syria, or the possible introduction of U.S. combat ground forces into either country, then this rule will tie their hands for the next 2 months. If any member introduces a privilege resolution under the terms of the War Powers Resolution, this rule freezes that resolution in place and stops the clock that would normally advance under the War Powers Resolution. It is perfectly clear that the House will not debate and vote on an authorization on Iraq at this time. Unfortunately, it is not clear if any vote will ever happen at any time in this House, even after we come back in November, even though there's a growing bipartisan consensus that such an authorization is needed. This rule freezes out each and every member of this House from taking any action to move forward the possibility of a vote on Iraq or Syria under the terms put in place by the War Powers Resolution. On August 8th, the U.S. began daily bombing in Iraq, at first to protect the Yazidis trapped on Mount Sinjar, but almost immediately the bombing campaign expanded to include infrastructure, and then to provide air support to ground operations to retake territory by Iraqi and Kurdish military forces, and then to protect more major infrastructure, and this week to dislodge ISIL from the environs of Baghdad. For 6 weeks, I have been waiting patiently for the leadership of this House to recognize that what we all know is true. The United States is engaged in hostilities and carrying out sustained combat operations in Iraq, and that it is the time for the House to debate and vote on an authorization. Yesterday, this House voted to authorize training and equipping Syrian opposition forces, but we have yet to debate and vote on an authorization for the combat operations we are already carrying out in Iraq. Over 150 airstrikes, bombs falling nearly every day in Iraq. And if that doesn't count as sustained combat, then I don't know what the hell does. I hear the Senate is drafting an authorization, but no such leadership is happening here in the House. The Speaker says he's waiting for the White House to send a request for an authorization to the House. But as I've said before, the President has stated that he thinks he has all the authority in the world that he needs or wants. It is Congress that is failing to carry out its constitutional responsibilities. It is Congress that is shirking its duties. It is Congress that is sniping from the sidelines while avoiding any responsibility for the servicemen and women that we are placing in harm's way. In July, this House overwhelmingly passed a resolution that I offered along with Walter Jones and Barbara Lee, requiring the House to vote on an authorization. And I have been waiting, patiently and respectfully, for the Speaker to schedule such a vote. Instead, this rule goes in the opposite direction, shutting down the ability of any member to introduce a privilege resolution and allowing it to mature as we set forth in the War Powers Resolution. Now, I understand that this restriction is often included when Congress is in recess for a prolonged period of time. But this time is different, Mr. Speaker, and every member of this chamber knows it's different. Not only are we engaged in sustained combat operations in Iraq, I ask an additional 30 seconds.
Additional minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Not only are we engaged in sustained combat operations in Iraq, but the President announced last week that he intends to escalate and expand those military operations, and quite likely extend them into Syria. This is a moment in history when the House should not and must not remain silent, let alone slink out of town. We have a responsibility to act. And until that happens, until we get an ironclad commitment from the leadership of this House that we will debate and vote on an authorization, then I would urge my colleagues to vote down this rule. We have a constitutional responsibility when it comes to war. Now, I don't believe we should go into another war, but whether you agree with me or you think we should launch into another war, we have an obligation, a constitutional responsibility to debate and to vote on that authorization. We are not doing that. I urge the Speaker to give us that commitment. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The gentleman from Massachusetts well understands that we handled a privileged resolution on the floor where there was a vote a little bit more than a month ago before the last break. What the gentleman wants to do is to bring Congress back to come and grandstand on the floor for a privileged resolution during the break. The gentleman well understands the rules of the House, the privileges that he is given as a member, and he knows that he has approached me numerous times, as well as the Speaker of the House, who has offered the gentleman every opportunity under the rules of the House that any member would have. What this very clearly says is we will not start that clock while we're on recess. And that is a normal and regular thing for the House to do, for the rules of this House to protect all the members. I see no reason to. The gentleman just had time and spoke his words. I thank the gentleman very much. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman, the Vice Chairman of the Rules Committee from Grandfather Community, North Carolina, Mrs. Fox.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the rule and the underlying bill. Each year, Washington imposes thousands of pages of rules and regulations on America's private sector employers, as well as state and local governments. Buried in those pages are costly federal mandates that make it harder for businesses to hire and cash-strap states, counties, and cities to serve their citizens. There are some who may not understand why a bill to improve the regulatory process is also a bill about jobs. As a former small business owner, I understand firsthand the concerns job creators have about how lengthy, confusing rules affect their ability to conduct business and provide jobs and opportunities to their employees. That's why I introduced H.R. 899, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act, which we call UMETA, and am glad to see it included in H.R. 4, the Jobs for America Act. The bill builds upon the bipartisan 1995 Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, also known as UMRA, and will ensure awareness and public disclosure of the cost in dollars and jobs that federal dictates pose to the economy and local governments. H.R. 899, as included in H.R. 4, does not seek to prevent the federal government from regulating. Rather, it seeks to ensure that its regulations are deliberative and economically defensible. Asking regulators to thoroughly consider and understand the cost of a rule in addition to its benefits should not be controversial. It's just plain common sense. Regulators and legislators should know exactly what they are asking the American people to pay and whether the cost of compliance might make it harder for family businesses to meet payroll and stay afloat. And no government body, on purpose or accidentally, should skirt public scrutiny when jobs and scarce resources are at stake. In the nearly 20 years since UMRA's passage, weaknesses in the law have been revealed, weaknesses that some government agencies and independent regulatory bodies have exploited. UMETA makes independent regulatory agencies subject to UMRA's requirements, ending a two-tier system that allowed regulations to be implemented without the required consideration, scrutiny, or public input. H.R. 899 recognizes that the federal government's reach extends way beyond the taxes it collects and the money it spends. Regulations can advance government initiatives without using tax dollars. Rather than count expenses for new programs, the government can require the private sector, as well as state and local governments, to pay for federal initiatives through compliance costs. This bill shines much-needed light on the murky regulatory process and ensures the public has transparent access to proposed rules and regulations. Both Democrats and Republicans recognize that appropriate regulations don't need to be issued in the dead of night or negotiated behind closed doors. That is why the House passed H.R. 899 with bipartisan support earlier this year. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and the underlying bill and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise?
Thank you. I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Massachusetts, my colleague on the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern.
The gentleman.
Thank you. I think the gentleman, I won't need a minute and a half, but I want to be.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I want to be clear for members. The privileges that are afforded to members of this House to vote on the war, those privileges are taken away by this rule. And I want to assure the gentleman from Texas, my colleague and my friend, that I am not interested in grandstanding. And any such a suggestion I find offensive, quite frankly. What I'm interested in is us doing our job. And I want to remind my colleagues that war is a big deal. It is a big deal. And it is long past time that this House treated it as such. We have a constitutional responsibility that we're not living up to. And we voted in July overwhelmingly to say that if there are sustained combat operations in Iraq, we're going to have a vote on that. Well, there are sustained combat operations in Iraq. We are much more deeply involved today than we were in July. And I predict by the time we come back in November, we will be even more deeply involved. When are we going to do our job? When are we going to vote? That's what my complaint is about, I would say to the gentleman from Texas. My complaint is that we are not living up to our constitutional responsibilities. And I thank the gentleman from Colorado for yielding.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks time? Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. With great respect to the gentleman from Massachusetts, I appreciate his insistence on the floor. Respect that very much. I think that this House is respectfully doing its obligations and duties, and that's what we're doing here today, trying to work with the American people so that we can once again move a jobs package forward.